Good morning, all. I see that you are all still filtering in, and we'll give you a couple minutes to get settled in here this morning. My name's Kevin Smith, and I'm going to be the moderator for our session today, Lead Like Aristotle, Not Like Plato. And that will be presented by Dr. Brent Stubbs, who's the Vice President at Savannah Technical College. So just take your time, get settled in, and make yourself comfortable for what I think is going to be an edutainment experience today by Dr. Stubbs. So we'll wait another couple of minutes, Brent, before we advance the slide and just kind of let people filter in. I see we're closing in on over 90 people, and couldn't be happier. We've got a great session about to kick off on day 3 of the Continuing Education Training Institute. Whether you've been in all the sessions or this is your first session today, we want to thank you for spending time with us. It's been a great week so far. We have over 3,000 individual registrations for the sessions this week, and we have already presented to close to 850 participants going into this morning's sessions. Just a great week, and we're getting a lot of great comments from the presenters that we've had so far, and I'm sure that will continue throughout the week. So let's go ahead and move to our next slide, please. Okay, thank you. As many of you know, and you heard from Brent Stubbs' introduction video, that we were supposed to be in Savannah today. And because of all the crazy stuff going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided for everybody's safety to do this virtually. When we made that decision, not a single one of the sponsors that you see here backed out. They all believed that this was worth doing virtually and continuing in the great tradition that CETI has had in the past to have industry and education meet to talk about what things are required to identify the skill gaps and how we're going to meet those skill gaps for our nation. And I can't think of a better time to be talking about that than right now. So just take note of who the sponsors are for this year's event, and you know, when you run into any of these great folks, either virtually or face-to-face, thank them for their support. Next chart, please. Just some simple housekeeping rules. This session is being recorded. The links to the PDF file for the presentation and the recordings will be made available after the end of the week. We'll be sending those out to everyone who registered for today's session. So whether you're here listening to this now or something came up spare the moment, which happens to quite a few of us, you'll still get a copy of the presentation and the recording. We want you to have that to be a part of this great week. All attendees, when you sign in, are automatically muted when joining. You'll note that at the bottom of the navigation bar is a Q&A box. That is where, if you have questions for the presenter, you can log your questions in there. And then at the end of the session, I'll review those questions with Dr. Stubbs and we'll give you those answers. If for any reason there are any unanswered questions, those responses will still be sent out with the recording when the information gets sent out to all registrants. We'd ask you also to please take time out to post social media using our hashtag CETI 2020, and also consider joining the CETI alumni group that is now on LinkedIn. The purpose of that group is, you know, after the dust is settled from this great week's, you know, presentations, it allows us a place to go and have future networking where we can share lessons learned, discuss best practices in this training industry that we're in, and just basically share ideas and experience to help others with, you know, the challenges they've got, you know, find opportunities that are out there that have maybe helped you, that could help, you know, one of your counterparts in the days ahead. Next chart, please. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker this morning, Dr. Brent Stubbs. Brent currently serves as the Vice President for Economic Development at Savannah Technical College and is a local, regional, and national leader in adult education career pathways. Brent has helped to build the adult education and college credit dual enrollment program and innovative short-term training programs that can connect underserved populations with economic opportunity. Brent has served as Dean for Adult Education, Dean for General Studies, and Vice President for Adult Education. It's my honor and privilege to present to you Dr. Brent Stubbs.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you to the entire ProTrain family for your willingness to continue to do this amazing conference despite COVID-19. I don't know about the rest of you on this, and unfortunately, this will be one of the first times I've made a presentation like this where I can't see your beautiful faces. I cannot see your looks of needing more clarification and get the feedback that's helpful to keep me going. But I'm going to give you my very best and promise that by the time you get done with this, if you've got a little bit of hunger in your stomach, hopefully you'll have forgot about it, and then you'll come to at the end of it and go, wow, I need to go eat lunch. But maybe you've got some lunch in front of you, or maybe if you're on the West Coast, you've got breakfast. And again, I hope that you find this very, very much informative and helpful to you. I am the Vice President for Economic Development. I say lay philosopher. Won't go into all of that background in terms of my education, but I am, or had hoped to have been, your local tour guide here at the college. But before we get started, I wanted to make a few disclaimers about this presentation, and I don't know enough about each of your backgrounds to know what you know or don't know about this topic or what intrigued you. But first, that's a little halo there with the not included or not required or we're not allowed. This is not a wholesale apologia, defense of Aristotle and every view that he has. That is not what I'm doing here. There are certainly views that Aristotle has that are reprehensible, while at the same time very much constitutive of the time in which he was in. But you know what? We experience that and make that distinction every single day, that people say some things that we should dismiss and say some things that we should hold. We probably did that with our parents for most of our lives, and even in all of our relationships every single day. Even though somebody says something we might disagree with, it doesn't mean that we discredit them completely. In fact, in logic, we call that a genetic fallacy. But the other disclaimer is this, is that for those of you who might, maybe an Aristotle scholar has somehow happenstanced into this presentation and is here to say, Brent, you are painting with a broad stroke here. In fact, I intend to do that. So again, the disclaimer here with that large paintbrush is that I am going to present to you information in a way that is broad. The point of this presentation isn't to go into the fine tooth comb details of Aristotle and Plato's philosophy, but to use this hopefully as a helpful way of thinking about something. In fact, let me talk a little bit about what I hope to accomplish. And Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind on this slide, going ahead and putting up our first poll. I'd love to get your feedback. But here's what I would like to accomplish today. To provide you a new way of kind of looking at a common leadership challenge that we all experience. And I'll talk about that here in just a minute. And also talk to you, maybe if you are someone, and if you're taking the poll question right now, what's a simple, if you could find a way of reframing, a simple way of reframing frustration that helped you significantly reduce its effects on you and your team, would that be a useful tool for you as a leader or coach of leaders? It's about building out your toolkit. So it's good to know both this new way of looking things, but also just a brief explanation of maybe why it's been invisible to us. And then we're going to move in towards the end of the presentation, how emerging fields of study and innovative leaders are rediscovering this lost insight, and how you can lead like Aristotle and reduce frustration. If we want to go ahead and close that poll, we can look at the results. That would be great. Yeah, so good. And we've got no one here that has no idea why they're in this session. That's fantastic. And I'm glad. It looks like I've got some philosophers here who are mildly skeptical of the question itself. So we'll go ahead and close that poll out. And moving right along, talk a little bit about, I'm going to just close this here on my screen, how I got here. So not just as a leader myself, but as someone who manages and mentors and coaches directors and deans and department heads. I started to see this thing that would emerge, and certainly you can find it even in your personal life, maybe with friends. You'll hear these phrases, if they would just, this frustration that bursts forth from people when, the reality of their work life or their environment or the reality of how something's going doesn't match this idea that they had in their head. Now, I don't think they would frame it that way, but I started to ask myself when I saw this continuing to come and kind of bubble up to the top in conversation, is that, let's just see here. All right. Is that this common experience of frustration and the ways that we process and think about frustration, we do it emotionally, we do it physically. Certainly frustration can result in stress in our bodies, but could at the root of this frustration that's so common or that many of us have experienced, or as a coach or mentor of leaders that we've seen in others, could it be a matter of assumptions or first principles? And so for me, with my academic background and just personal study and the way I approach life, it reminded me of this kind of fundamental, and I won't say debate as much, but fundamental disagreement that Plato and Aristotle had about basically the nature of how we know things. What, if maybe you remember it from a philosophy class, epistemology, big word for simply saying how we know things, or how we come to know things, or the nature of those things that we know. And so Raphael in the 15th century captures this distinction between Plato and Aristotle in just one image. And so if you're looking on the screen right now with me, if we were in a live presentation, I could, on a stage, I could point up to it. If you'll notice on your left, you find Plato, and on your right, Aristotle. And if you look at their hands, Raphael, is communicating to us really this fundamental distinction between where Plato sees the most important facts that you can find, and where Aristotle believes you can find the most important constituent parts of reality. And so Plato is pointing up, right? And Aristotle has his hand facing down. And in fact, this summarizes very nicely in one image the distinction between Plato and Aristotle. And so I thought, as a leader, could it be that this distinction is playing out? Setting aside for our point today, whether people aren't maybe psychologically predisposed to one position or another, but rather starting from the assumption that we might, in fact, if this is invisible to us, take a certain position, either Platonic or Aristotelian, without even knowing it, and that begin to impact how we evaluate and act as leaders and as managers, both of projects and people. And so on your left is Plato, the mystic staring off into the sky, where the realm of the forms, and maybe this goes all the way back to high school for you, you maybe remember his allegory of the cave, where the idea was that this world that we live in isn't really what's true, right? That this world, because it's constantly changing, and so we are really just looking at these images that are given to us, but the real way that you escape this dilemma is to come out of the cave and to contemplate this realm of the forms. And so for Plato, the philosopher is the king. He is the one who's able to kind of pull himself or herself out of society, out of our out of the menial tasks of everyday life, to put it in the context of what you do, the day in and day out grind. For Plato, the manager of your continuing education department or your company, he or she, she would have to pull herself completely away and contemplate those ideas. But on your right, you have this idea of Aristotle. What we find in Aristotle, again, very primitive, but for many, the father of empiricism, this idea of getting your hands dirty, of the tinkerer, of actually observing individual phenomena, coming into encounter with a thing, a phone, a desk, a dog, a person, and learning something from that encounter. So just very briefly, why is this distinction potentially invisible to us? If you would throw Stephanie, the next poll question up here. So how familiar are you with this distinction between Plato's and Aristotle's view? And really, I'm asking before this presentation. So I know I just gave you a very small overview, but coming into this presentation, just so I understand my audience, how familiar are you with the distinction between Plato and Aristotle's view? And so we'll leave that poll question up for the next few minutes, and I'll go through a few slides here and talk about a little bit why this distinction is invisible to us. Before Plato and Aristotle, we typically look at Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates as a significant inflection point in the history of thought, and that before them, you had many thinkers, but those thinkers weren't systematic in their approaches. We might even say that they were mythological or simply just conjectured ideas. Now, some modern science seems to think that in some cases they may have been onto things. But for example, the Pythagoreans, who, again, if that word means anything to you, the Pythagorean theorem, they were mystics. In fact, they stood on poles and meditated for days without eating. This certainly isn't the picture that might come to your mind in terms of mathematics and science, but before what we call the pre-Socratics, that in fact was the way that philosophy was engaged. And so in Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, we have this inflection point. And so now I'm going to give you a super fast version here on one slide of what I call the history of forgetting. And Stephanie, if you go ahead and close that poll very quickly, let's just kind of see. So perfect. So not familiar at all, a little familiar, somewhat, and perfect. I know those two people that said extremely familiar were also the two people that were a little skeptical and not sure if this was helpful for them. So we'll go ahead and close that, but thank you for the feedback. All right, so this is what I call a very quick history of forgetting. So here's that image again of Plato and Aristotle. And so in Western civilization, Western European civilization, we lost Aristotle. In fact, in some ways, probably one of the most influential thinkers in Western society was Augustine, who through Plotinus, a later Platonic thinker, made Plato's ideas very influential in the West and in the way that we think about the world. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, just to say a lot of the ways that you and I take for granted, a lot of ideas we take for granted, come from Plato and his influence. And so, like I mentioned, though, we lost Aristotle, literally lost his texts. We didn't look at that. And it wasn't until in the medieval period that the Islamic philosophers, one of whom was Avicenna, who interprets or gets this text of Aristotle and is able to gift this, or this text through Avicenna makes its way into Europe. And here then we have this figure of Aquinas, who we know looked to synthesize Aristotle with theology and his faith and reason. So we have this slight little blip of Aristotle that comes back onto the scene, again, very influential both in the Islamic world, in if you will, the East, and then in the West in terms of Aquinas. And subsequent to that, though, Aristotle kind of falls out of fashion again. And so in the early modern period, we have people like Descartes and Leibniz who are, there's an open debate on who of them founded calculus. Certainly Leibniz, I would argue, and then Descartes, we think about analytic geometry. So both as scientists and thinkers, but also as philosophers, but in many ways rejecting some of the insights of Aristotle and putting forward what I would call Platonic views of the world. Hume comes along as a resurgence of skepticism. We might say this skepticism, what's called Pyrrhonian skepticism, that happens before Plato and Aristotle, and kind of puts a big question mark on the whole project of philosophy. And so Kant comes along and, writes a book that says, hey, can we even do philosophy anymore? And so we forgot about philosophy. It's not quite that simple of a history, but Kant forward is, maybe Hume forward, is a steady decline of the importance of philosophy, and we might track that along with a steady incline of what we think in terms of the natural sciences. Now, of course, Newton was also a mystic and an alchemist, and not quite someone who we could hold up today as objective or falling within how we might think of an empirical scientist today. And so we forgot about philosophy. And so that's why, when I asked who knows this distinction, everyone's like, most people were like, I don't know this distinction. But Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton in the early 20th century had this idea of the Chesterton fence. Well, I'm calling it the Chesterton tools. And this is a quote from Chesterton: "The more modern type of a reformer goes gaily up to it and says, 'I don't see the use of this. Let us clear it away,' to which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then, when you can come back and tell me what you do, that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it.'" The idea being this, is the usefulness of the tool, being able to define why philosophy is important is really kind of the premise of Chesterton's idea for being able to then dismiss it. And so I ask you, as a leader, many of you saying you don't understand this, do you have all the tools you need as a leader? And I think thinking philosophically, thinking deeply about the important questions, and particularly this distinction between how we come to really know the world. And I'll show you here real quickly in just a few minutes some thinkers that I think are starting to unlock what I think is a basic Aristotelian insight. And so asking this question, what is frustration? This is a philosophical question, right? Where we step back from the phenomenon, we ask the question what it is. Is it a gift? Or is it something to be avoided? And in fact, if it is something that we're trying to avoid, why are we trying to avoid it? Now, you might think, or one might think, that you can just simply dismiss philosophy. And this is, on your left here, you have Agnes Callard, PhD, Berkeley in philosophy, who happens to also be someone who appreciates the insights of Aristotle. And on your right, you have Eric Weinstein, who's a PhD in mathematical physics. And it's a fascinating 2.5-hour interview. But throughout the interview, it was obvious, for as intelligent and as much of a polymath as Weinstein is, he had simply not asked some fundamental questions that Agnes was able to show were really kind of deficient in his thinking. And I thought to myself, look, here's someone who has a PhD in mathematical physics, but just a little bit of philosophical thinking goes a long way in challenging your assumptions about the world. So very briefly, let's summarize here this distinction between Plato, who is the idealist, who focuses on, this world of perfection and the ideals, and Aristotle, the empiricist. And so the idealist perspective is, again, where there is this idea of the philosopher king, where we pull ourselves back from society and we pull ourselves out of our projects, we pull ourselves out of our programs. We operate from, we might call the ivory tower. And in fact, we come to know what is true through getting out of the nitty-gritty of our actual programs. Now, I also like to think of this contemporarily as models versus experience. And I think all of us have probably been very frustrated, and I know I've been through this entire COVID-19 experience because of our over-reliance on models and the seemingly day by day, week by week, hour by hour ineffectiveness of those models in relationship to even just eyeball tests. But over here you have Aristotle, and again, another way of thinking of yourself as a leader, the tinkerer. And how I come to know things is by going in and getting into, immersing myself into the thing that I want to know. And instead of models, I put this over here, analyzing the individual. Now, in a lot of ways in our culture and in our, in our intellectual stage, we've already picked a winner. We seem to have a preference for utopianistic thinking, the idea that there's some place in which we can achieve perfection. We can, whether it's in our programs or models, or whether it's in eliminating some particular ill. Even this basic idea of selfishness. For Plato, he felt like selfishness had to be eliminated, and his ideal society was one where even children were shared and no one had children per se. Whereas for Aristotle, he saw that selfishness was something that could be used to our benefit and we could not simply wish it away. But I also think an interesting way in which we have taken on a Platonic worldview and not even known it is in how we think in terms of averages and algorithms. And I'll talk about the implications of that and some emerging research on the next slide. But we're constantly obsessed with information that is really simply a mathematical rendering of the relationship of our ideas instead of actually giving us more information about the thing itself. And in science, we have emerging literature that points to both a broken models problem in mathematics. There is emerging research that there's an overemphasis or an over-fascination with the beauty of a model instead of its utility or practicality or even explanatory powers. But also, and maybe all of you are aware of this, is the replication crisis in social sciences in terms of our research. So let's now talk about some solutions and how I believe this emerging insight by Aristotle is kind of bubbling its way up in society. A great book I recommend, The End of Average by Todd Rose. He works at Harvard University at the Laboratory for the Science of Individuality. And the insight is this, and there's so many numerous examples that show it, that aggregating before we analyze, that gathering data to build a perfect model. In fact, many people don't realize this. If you've read the book, this will be redundant. If you haven't, it's, I think, the main insight of the book is that the application of using averages within the context of human behavior is not just novel, but in fact is built on an assumption, was built on one of two assumptions. One of the assumptions was that average was the ideal. The other assumption was that average was the median. So think about how that has impacted how we view human beings, and even maybe how you view yourself. You know, am I closer to the average income, so that makes me okay? Or did I get the average grade in the class, and that must mean I'm just average? These are ways that we're thinking about building up what I think is this Platonic ideal, and we use average as a kind of code swap for the Platonic form or the ideal. What Todd Rose has found is that these basic assumptions result in horrible implications for how we design things for human beings. We all might be familiar with his TED Talk or others that bring up the common example of the cockpit design in the Air Force. And in fact, when they made all of these measurements to develop the ideal cockpit, when they actually created the cockpit, no one could fit in it properly. Because interestingly enough, even though they had all of these metrics on the average dimensions of a pilot, no one pilot had any of those particular dimensions. No pilot had the average hand size or the average foot size. So it was a complete fiction. And in fact, the Air Force then developed adjustable seating and adjustable features that met the needs of the individual. I think this is a basic Aristotelian insight, that if we, and even in how we come to know something, you know, think about it in your own programs. Think about it in what you do. Do you start with a spreadsheet or do you start with a conversation? And I think good ideas are making a comeback. If I could retitle this slide, I would almost say Aristotle's making a comeback. In fact, I was at Kroger's, which is a grocery store here, just a few days ago, and the young man who was helping me there, his name was Aristotle, and I thought, well, goodness, Aristotle's not just making a comeback intellectually. I told the young man, I said, "Ooh, that's quite a name. Wow, that's a lot to live up to, or maybe even to improve upon." So these two thinkers here, Seth Godin on your left is a tremendous thinker. And so I want to share a video from him, and we're going to go ahead and do that now.
About a year ago, I did a Kickstarter campaign, and in less than 3 hours, we hit our goal, and we sold out everything in about 3 days. So it's an overnight success. But of course, it wasn't an overnight success. It took me 10 years to earn the connection with the tribe that led to this. So the big insight for me was that, in fact, yes, if you want to know if it pays, it does pay. It pays to build a group of people, a tribe that are connected to one another and to you, and that trust you. You know, it turned out that the prizes were a thrill to make and a privilege to deliver to people. But that's not what Kickstarter is for, not what Kickstarter is actually good at. It's a huge, huge bureaucratic hassle to deal with Kickstarter. No, what Kickstarter is an emblem and a symbol of whether or not you have already figured out how to serve a tribe.
So two thoughts from Seth that I find interesting, but first just a general comment about Seth. I kind of find him as a kind of modern philosopher who asked this really fundamental question. What is this thing? What is it? And with Kickstarter, he has this kind of neat insight, which is it's really not doesn't kickstart anything, it finishes things. In fact, I had a friend who launched a product on Kickstarter, but it was because he had already done all the work, thousands of hours to develop the project, and he had developed a tremendous base on social media that was hungry for that product to come to the final step and move to the market. And so his project was a huge success, but not because Kickstarter did anything. But something else that Seth mentioned in here subtly, he talked about the tribe. And this phrase up here is a title. Seth talks about the smallest viable audience. You know, we often delude ourselves thinking that everyone wants our product. In fact, think about it today. Maybe you provide online education and you thought that was unique. And then COVID-19 happened and now everyone is in that space. How are you going to stand out? I don't think it's going to be by coming and building the most perfect fill in the blank. Seth's insight is that if we really connect with our customers, if we really find out who our real audience is, who are the people who really want what we make, and we tailor it to them, not to an algorithm, not to a set of features that we think make sense, but we actually build our products, our services, we actually build our classes for an audience that we build trust with, an audience that we've come to know, an audience that we understand. If you can't name who that customer is, who that audience member is, one name, 5 names, I really don't think you've actually done the work it takes to be successful today. You know, we used to, as a country, have 3 or 4 media outlets. We'd sit and watch our 6 or 7 shows. And we're now in the age of the long tail of the internet, something that Seth has been both a part of building, but also a part of kind of yelling at everyone and saying, look at it, know what it is that you're looking at. You know, the walled gardens, the curators are running out of time because the internet enables us to connect to the smallest viable audience. So who is your smallest viable audience? Let me go ahead and move to the next slide here. Now, Jesse Cole was the guy on the right with the yellow suit. And I really wish that you could have been here this summer, and maybe you'll still visit. I highly recommend you visit Savannah once it's safe. Whether you wait till next summer, I wouldn't. I would come now. There's some amazing deals, you know, again, when it's very safe. But the Savannah Bananas are an incredible story of one man, I think, rejecting so many of the movements to focus on, you know, reaching this unbelievably abstract concept of a customer, of building up an email list, of all the things that we think about that are important. And what Jesse's done is done something very simple. Let's hear from him.
The days of just marketing your business and product are over. If you want to succeed, you have to think differently to stand out.
It's not even a baseball game, it's a circus. It's a circus.
Taking pictures from a magazine. If you're like everyone else, you're going to get results like everyone else. I believe every business has one thing that makes them stand out. It's the best version of themselves. If you want more, you got to do more. It's as simple as that. Whatever's normal, do the exact opposite. And for me, normal gets normal results. The next step is to love your customers more than you love your product. What is the perfect experience for your customer? Start there. Attention beats marketing 1,000% of the time. You know, it's the difference you make in people's life that matters most. Everything we do is fans first, and that's to take care of our customers. Be patient in what you want for yourself, but be impatient in how much you give to others. So stand out, be different, have fun, and enjoy the show. Thank you.
When I moved to Savannah 7.5 years ago, we went as a family to the Catholic night in the ballpark, and the bishop threw out the pitch. Now, despite all of that fanfare, and in a historically Catholic, or more Catholic city in the South, there were not many. There was, you know, there was the groups from the parishes there, but it was still pretty bare. This guy, Jesse Cole, has taken a minor league baseball team, bought it, turned it into something even less, you know, in the ranking of minor league baseball, much smaller than, of less significance than that. I think it's like a summer college league. And he's turned it into a multi-million-dollar business. Are there projects, are there parts of your corporate training program that need some serious help? Is your online continuing education program dying on the vine? If you are really brutally honest and you spent an entire day just looking at your business, looking at your educational operation, are the things that are just, quite frankly, they could get so much better. You know, what did Jesse do? Did Jesse go big data? Did Jesse, you know, is he chasing people around on the internet everywhere? And you can go ahead and put, Stephanie, the last poll question here for the presentation. What did Jesse do? I think what Jesse did is he understood that if he loses sight of being obsessed of each customer's experience, you know, he has carefully curated something. When you buy a ticket for the Savannah Bananas, you get an email that has a video they've made that shows you how your ticket was custom made for you. On your way to the ballpark, you receive a playlist for your iPhone so that you can get hyped and get ready. When you walk into the stadium, there are people dressed up in bananas. There's the star players handing out gifts and tickets. All of their tickets include all-you-can-eat food and drink on a wide variety of items. They have created an end-to-end amazing experience, and they have taken people like myself who could be considered barely baseball fans to having one place that I want to take my kids and my family in this city during the summer. You know, if you want to capitalize and learn more about how you can help your customers, you're going to have to spend time with them. You know, do you have a discovery or a discomfort orientation? It's amazing. Jesse and I'll be hopefully having a leadership conference here in Savannah in September, a small leadership conference focused on just locals. But, you know, fabulous. So we have a lot of you know, people that are doing the right things here, spending time interacting and paying attention to their customers. Perfect. So, you know, thinking about how you engage with your programs, your leaders, with situations that arrive, you know, having a discovery versus discomfort orientation. You know, are you annoyed that someone comes into your office all the time? Are you annoyed that your email system doesn't work? Are you, you know, uncomfortable or you have discomfort? Or do you find each of those feedback points, each of those pain points as opportunities to learn something? You know, Jesse is going to be joining me hopefully in September, but watching him and getting to know him and seeing his success, he is very open about all the ideas that they've tried and failed at. And also, one of the things that he does, even as the owner and the master showman, is he comes in and all of their staff does it. They anonymously shop. They're in there in disguised. They want to make sure that every part of that baseball stadium is an amazing experience. Let's just make sure. You know, again, this idea of an emperor or a tinkerer. You know, Jim Collins, his book Good to Great, he made popular the phrase MBWA. And I know this is a little harder in the world of physical distancing. I'm currently in my office at my campus, but the door is shut and we have a very sparse campus. MBWA, management by walking around. Are you getting involved in your program? You know, if you're a director or a vice president, maybe a CEO, how much do you really know about your program? And look, this is just another way of saying that perfection is the enemy of good, of even excellent. You know, if you've got a utopia, I'll show you mine. But here's the deal. I've never seen utopia. I've never seen a utopian family. I've never seen a utopian small business. I've never seen a utopian education system. Taking utopia or the goal of some ideal or perfection and setting it to the side, and instead looking to accomplish iterative excellence through constantly engaging your customers, constantly involving yourself in your business processes is critical to success. You know, it's an age-old question, to data or not to data, or really it's, if you think about it, the way in which even in research, and maybe you're in university, we think about qualitative versus quantitative research as kind of two schools of thought. That's ridiculous. In fact, I find that to be a kind of Platonic construct. In fact, instead, we should use qualitative research, the conversations that we spend, to find the most important information about our customers, and then use quantitative research to study it, to learn more, to see if there's trends and commonalities of those customers. So I challenge you to become Aristotle, the change agent. You know, like Jesse, I think we all have been, look at what we have right now and know things have to change. Whether that was because of things before this crisis or what's happening right now. You know that business as usual is no longer good enough. And so I encourage you to analyze first, to take the thing that you think you need to change and really spend time studying it to see what's there, to make sure you understand it before you walk into the room and say, hey, we're going to start doing this. And then begin to aggregate, like Todd Rose and his center at Harvard, that you know, in his book, he shows multiple times where there's been many breakthroughs in modern science today because of not doing the reverse. But I don't know about you, but I've certainly been guilty of starting with the spreadsheet and then doing the analysis, right? Of reaching the conclusion based upon the trend that I see in the data, without asking the questions first, or even going into the classroom, going into the project room and finding out. So I encourage you also to build these feedback loops. We built one of the most important programs we built in the college, a hospitality program focused on second language learners, linked to some of the very best properties in our community. And we built it out of one of the feedback loops that I had, which was to go sit at my front desk and have, as adult education students would come in, to spend a day just listening. And I had an Iraqi immigrant who, for 1 hour, chewed my ear out about how English as a second language classes really weren't good enough, and that he could learn all the information that we were teaching on his phone, on a bus, just through living life. That he knew that what immigrants really needed to be secure in our country is not just English, but skills that made them less vulnerable to people who wanted to take advantage of them. You know, that conversation led me to walk out, talk to my ESL coordinator and say, this is the direction we've got to go. And in turn, we've been steadily building in that direction. Hospitality, entrepreneurship, and we're looking at adding some other programming in there as well. So building these feedback loops provide us the input we need to be iterative and to also not find out something that the data could tell us, find out something that only in that encounter we can know. And the third point here is choose discovery. I think this is the simple insight to eliminating frustration, is that when something happens and it doesn't map up to what you thought was supposed to happen, or it isn't consistent with what you think ought to happen, choose discovery. What insight can I learn from this? And in particular, something that I always challenge my leaders to do is ask the question, what could I have done as the leader differently? right? Not what the instructor could have done, what could the students have done differently, what could the third-party payment processor have done differently. Leadership starts with taking ownership with your actions. And so, assuming I'm speaking to leaders on this presentation, which I know I am, as leaders, it's easy to point out what someone else can do, but it really starts with you assessing what can I do to be different and to be a part of this whole system, so that next time the result is different. Which really implies the fourth, which is, as leaders, you need to get dirty. You've got to get involved in your programs now more than ever. This isn't the time, maybe to hand things over to the technologist to say, hey, build us this stuff and come back and tell us when it's ready. Now more than ever, maybe you aren't technologically savvy, but you have a tremendous content background. You need to be at that table as the leader, having those conversations and making sure that what's built, going back to that Chesterton fence idea, that ideas that seem like they can be thrown away, maybe there's an insight that you can bring to the table that will remind everyone why that practice or why that protocol should still be in place. So what I hoped you learned today is this, that you learned a new way of looking at a common leadership challenge. I have a few philosophers on the call, and so for them, we can have a beer another day and enjoy a deeper conversation if they'd like. I host a reading group for about 5 years in my community, and you can email me. I'll give you my contact information. But I challenge you to begin to see. I find that people that are having great success are breaking out of averagenarian thinking, breaking out of algorithmic thinking, and realizing the power of the encounter of the individual. That they're realizing the power of the encounter of the individual person and that individual experience. Now, maybe you're sitting here thinking to yourself, but what I get told is that that's not really data. And maybe you come into your meeting and you have a leader who I would call platonic, who you come in and say, hey, listen, the customers are saying this, and they say, well, show me in the spreadsheet. Hang in there. Keep being a noisy, the squeaky wheel, and show them examples of people that are reevaluating this approach to solving problems. I'm not against data, I'm not against gathering data, but it's not the place we start first. It's the place we start after we've actually got ourselves a little dirty in the problem. And finally, I hope that you've considered a new way that you might be able to avoid frustration. And that maybe when you have frustration build up, you can think, is it because I have this assumption that the world should be perfect or that something should be this ideal? And breaking that down to realize instead what I'm experiencing is powerful feedback about how the world really works and how maybe I can change or help others change to make it a better world, right? The point of this isn't that we can't make the world a better place, and people that many times set up an ideal as their goal are doing just that. They really want to make the world a better place. But we have to work within the confines of what happens. If anything is true, is that we're all waking up to the idea that whether it's the environment, whether it's media, whether it's many other things, there is a real implication for our relationship to those things, our behaviors, and how we can or cannot live in accord with the truth and reality. So that's it. That's the presentation today. I really appreciate all of you for joining. I hope that you found it insightful and helpful, and hopefully I kept the nitty-gritty philosophy to a minimum and helped you introduce you to some new thinkers and leaders as well. Thank you.
Well, Brent, thank you for what I think was an educational and entertaining presentation. I'll remind our audience that we have a Q&A box down below. Please start putting your questions in there. I've got a couple that came in through other means here. I got guys sending me questions all over the place. So I'm going to ask you a couple to lead off, and then I'm going to get down to the Q&A box. So first question is in this philosophical perspective that you've outlined today, Do you personally use that in your day-to-day approach to work, in your day-to-day approach to life, or do you use that to fall back on when you're faced with some deep problematic issue in terms of trying to look at things contextually?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kevin, and thank you for whoever asked it. So kind of Aristotle would talk. One of the things that he's still very praised for, and there's ideas that he's not praised for, is his idea of virtue, and virtue being, if you will, our character, and that we're not either good or bad, that we can become good, or we can, and through our actions and building up and through our habits, we can develop character or virtue. So I think, having this framework isn't something you can turn on or off. It is my philosophical framework. It's the way I view the world. I view the world as something that I have to take each encounter, whether it's my child coming to me and saying, this is how this made me feel, or it's extremely mundane, right? If you've built something with your hands before, you know that I may want this to work, but what's going to tell me if it works or not is if it actually stands up to the elements, or stands up to, in this case, a few weeks ago, I built a triple bunk bed for my boys, and it's rock solid, but they're going to test it every single day. In the military, and I wasn't in it, there's a common phrase that no plan survives first contact. And I think really that's this exact idea, that, we may have an idea in our head, but once we face reality, and so if that's our framework, I think it becomes even more important to build up that, if you will, repetition in the mundane, in the simple. Because then when we get to a difficult situation, what I find is that people who maybe don't have that framework in the little things, if you will, when it comes to the big issue, it just means their frustration goes to the roof, right? And as leaders, we've got to remain calm. We've got to stay calm and encourage people to, I think, apply these principles generally, if you will, but certainly, I think, to the person's question, when we have major issues or analyzing major issues, accepting them as opportunities to learn is critical, right? I mean, if your roof blows off because of a rainstorm, you can look at your roof and yell all you want that it was a good roof. It wasn't a good enough roof. And so, having that framework and watching and seeing, and accepting the feedback as reality telling you, in the case of the roof, it wasn't good enough. So the next roof you put on, I'm sure, won't be the one that will blow off.
Okay. First couple complimentary remarks. First, when we ground ourselves in gratitude, we can eliminate frustration. Remember to breathe. We got this. Great presentation. June, thank you for that comment. Another comment here that says, great presentation. We really like the approach that you provided us today. Next question. What are 3 ways you would avoid frustration with your team?
So 3 ways. And that's so one would be to just, again, challenge everyone to say, okay, if we're frustrated right now, what can I do differently? Right? So accepting frustrating moments aren't moments when you get awards. They're not moments when the sales are great. A frustrating moment is when something isn't working. And when something's not working, again, we have this tendency to either say it should have worked, right? And to keep fighting and spending a lot of time explaining all the reasons why our plan was rock solid. But what, the first step is, I think, just to acknowledge, hey, I think, so it would go to this, Kevin, rather than 3, I'm just going to say 1. Creating an environment where failure is acceptable.
So would you call that the first step? Would you call that the first step?
Yeah, I think it's a necessary condition. I think if people are afraid of failure, then they're always going to not tell you the whole truth. If they're afraid of failure, and if they don't tell you the whole truth, then you can't learn everything you need to learn from the, quote, failure. All failure is that there was something in there you need to learn from it. That's it. And that's all it was. Okay, let's learn from it. Let's try again.
Right.
It could be, let's learn from it and not do that again. But just building an environment where, you also praise in your people that tendency to take a situation and iterate. So when they come to you and say, listen, we were hoping to have 200 people in this class and we had 150, but I learned that the reason why it wasn't 200 is because of this and this, and I think next time if we do this and this, it'll be better. Perfect. Right now, I think what, well, that's not, the way that would really not work in that scenario, to do the opposite effect would be to look at the person and go, well, I'm glad you told me that, but maybe you should think about it next time before, and so we'll have 200. Terrible response. Terrible response. Helping that person embrace that learning opportunity and realize that there's not going to be a perfect outcome. Those just don't come along.
Comment about, you talked about the leaky roof. Philip says, a Haitian proverb says, the leaky roof fools the sun, but not the rain. You got to love that. Okay.
That's a great one.
Yeah. Okay, here's another good question. What would you recommend as a starting point for sharing with your staff? You recommend a book, a video that would get the conversation started regarding connecting more with customers on a deeper level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on where you want to go. I love Jesse's book, Find Your Yellow Tux. I love a book that's right behind me in my office, Joey Coleman, Never Lose a Customer Again. Those would be two. The second book is something I've taken my team through, and both of them are just about, Jesse's is more about you personally, whereas Joey Coleman's book is more about just becoming obsessed with totally renovating your customer's experience, where you create, again, the idea of never losing a customer. It's let's create, what Seth Godin calls whales, right? Let's create those whales of customers that just keep coming back for more.
Right. You talked a little bit about being a change agent. Okay. Tell us a little bit about your approach of being a change agent, and you and I have talked several times about your philosophy in looking at B2B training and some of the new ideas that you brought to that. Can you share a little bit about your philosophy and how that actually you've applied that to seeking out that B2B clientele that you think is so important in your service area to reach?
I'll give you a really concrete example, and it happens to be one, Kevin, that we've partnered on as a part of the project. We had a company come to us and really ask for something that we hadn't done before. But one of the things, as I was listening to the customer, is I could have had an instinct to just refer them. But it became a project that I thought, if we get involved with this, if they're building, and without getting into too much specifics, to keep this general and so it can apply in multiple contexts, when I started to really listen to what the customer was saying, I realized that as a part of this project, I would have an opportunity to help them think about how they were going to develop their training program as a company. Well, so it was a good project to get involved in, but little did we know, we couldn't anticipate COVID-19. But by building this deep relationship, doing amazing work for them on the first stage of the project, it turned into, second, third, fourth, fifth rounds of the project, because the company, we had built trust, and in exactly how we anticipated, is being at the table to connect to the customer in terms of business to business training and corporate education. So in the middle of this pandemic, they are growing their business and needed to hire more employees, but they're growing, and so they didn't have the staff to do the training of these new employees. So we were able to take that curriculum we'd already built, take the people that were involved in it, and provide new employee training, along with a partnership with you guys in AKT Optimize. We were able to develop some beautiful video content for that training. So, it's opening yourself up, being open to things that you haven't done before. Also, really listening to your customers, and as you look into the future, building those deep relationships enable you to be there when these kinds of things happen. And I say these kinds of things, unexpected events. I mean, we're also a coastal city that has occasional hurricanes. They hadn't had an evacuation in 30 years, and they've had 3 since I moved here, so I'm not too happy about that. But yeah, we just, you don't know what the future holds, but building those deep ties and listening and getting into projects that maybe are outside of your comfort zone, outside of what you think are your core competency, but sound like they should be because it fits right in what you should be doing. It's just your customers asking something different. There's another great book, and the author's name is going to elude me. Yes is the answer, and I think it's yes is the answer. What is the question? And it's really it's the idea that when your customer asks for something, they're always right. It's a hospitality and culinary focused book, but I think it applies generally to when your customer says, "Hey, can we do this?" That's a feedback loop. So it's not just, hey, if they ask you to do something like build us a house, we don't build houses. But if they ask you something that's in your world, it's just not what you've always done. This might be a feedback to where you should be going. So I think that's helpful to that question. I hope.
Right. In this new norm, business owners are asking, okay, how can I find ways to train and upskill and literally convert my workforce from a at-work workforce to an at-home workforce? Any ideas about how to go about that? Because there's a lot changing because of this new norm, if you will.
So I'm gonna approach this question not like we're within the context of this presentation, and I'm just looking and so what I would challenge leaders is to go back to some philosophical thinking and ask yourself, well, is working from home something that as human beings we know how to do? And history would tell us that most of human history we work from home, that we're in a very short experiment of people spending most of their time away from their homes. And we've also seen all kinds of interesting health anomalies. Certainly we've got a healthcare system that helps us live longer, but we've got new diseases, if you will, and things associated with stressors that could be associated with that. So how can we start out with the assumption maybe that we can be very highly functional from home? I think then the second thing would be trust. I think a lot of leaders are a little hesitant because they don't know if they can trust their employees from home. But if you can't trust your employees, don't add the phrase from home to it. Just trust your employees. You've got a problem. You have a problem that existed before you added the phrase from home. And from home has just brought out that underlying issue. That underlying issue could be that you have insecurities you need to work through as a leader. Maybe you don't trust people because you've been burned in life. And maybe burned as a child. I don't know what those are. I'm not here to psychoanalyze. But we got to look deep as leaders and ask ourselves, why are we having these concerns or fears? Patrick Lencioni was asked the question, a great management consultant, what is the most incompatible character trait with good leadership? Being insecure. So I think leading into this realm of the unknown is going to require secure leaders who can trust their people. And then also to his question or her question, find some training and for their employees to know how to do that. But I think they'll be surprised. I mean, as our younger workforce enters, as younger folks enter the workforce, they're pretty tech savvy. We've been doing some unique training during this pandemic with younger populations, and going into it, a lot of people thought, well, they're not going to be able to do all of this virtual stuff. And they were so ready for it, and it was our instructors that weren't ready. In fact, I had a young lady who was needing help, and she was on her phone and her iPad, and she had all these things going on at once, and it was unbelievable. But she was multitasking at a high level with multiple screens and doing it with ease. So that nascent talent is getting ready to enter the workforce in mass, and that's exciting.
Okay, I don't see any other questions or comments that are out there. So I would like to personally and professionally thank you for a great presentation, not only educational, but also entertaining. And several have commented on that today as well. So I want to thank those that have taken time out this morning to make this part of their day. I will also thank once again all of our sponsors who have stayed with us through and part of this large success, and remind those that depending on what your calendar's got available, our next presentation from Dr. Joe Perez is Strategize with Data from Concept to Implementation. That'll start at 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, and we hope that you will join us for that next session. Once again, Dr. Stubbs, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. Could not say more about, having you, with us today. Stay well, sir. Appreciate you. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you, ProTrain, and all the sponsors. Tremendous. You guys are amazing. You've done a great job with this. World class. Thank you.